What would be also your message? You know this country, you worked a lot on researching the Ukrainian history. Reading the books, there are a lot of talks about explaining how the fake news works. There is a lot which is intended for the US audience in that book. You know, you explain a lot the history of Europe, the history of Eastern Europe, and in particular events which had taken place here with the Crimean annexation by Russia. But there are some things which are extremely valuable also for Ukraine, because it's not on tyranny, and these risks are actual everywhere. So what would be your message also for the people in this part of the world?
As you say, but I'll put it more directly, many of the things that are in On Tyranny are lessons that I've learned from Ukrainians, from Ukrainian journalists, from people who work in Hromadske, from my own friends in Kiev. What I would say is that we are all in this together, that the lessons that are lessons for Americans tend also to be lessons for other people. What I thought I was doing was taking things that I knew about Eastern Europe and trying to teach them to Americans. But then it turned out that the discussion of the book was really just one discussion, that Poles and Turks and Malaysians and Koreans and Chinese people, in Libya, Egypt, I heard from people all over the world. So I think there was some kind of general resonance to this book. And in a way, what that means is that there's a general resonance to the experience of Ukrainians, because so much of what's in the book are things that I've learned from Ukrainians. It's especially, you mentioned fake news. So the people who understood what was happening in America in 2016 were very often Russians or Ukrainians or others who had experience with similar phenomena. So, I mean, I hope that my analysis is useful for Ukrainians. The lesson is that building a democracy or having a democracy is a constant process. It's a process of self-creation. It's about how you live your life. It's not just about winning or losing at one particular moment. What On Tyranny tries to do is to define ways to live, daily ways to live, monthly, yearly, ways of carrying yourself through life, which make it more likely that your society will remain democratic. I think that's a lesson for Ukrainians, but I think it's also a lesson that many Ukrainians have already figured out for themselves.
So, of course, there is also an international audience, and they would read the book, and that's what they understand full. But really, what are exactly, you know, there are 20 things you there is a call for action of what people are supposed to do. There is some kind of an advice, but what are the most important lessons from the history?
The most important lessons have to do with defining yourself as being a free person. So lesson number one is don't obey in advance. And that's a lesson which comes from historical scholarship about Germany in 1933. It turns out that during times of regime change from democracy to something else, to authoritarianism or totalitarianism, that people have a lot more power than they think they do. It turns out that in the first weeks and months of a regime change, what usually happens is that people who had rights give them away voluntarily. They consent by not doing anything. They consent by adjusting themselves internally or by not reacting to support their neighbors. And it's that kind of quiet consent which makes the regime change possible. So don't obey in advance. Having the ability to decide what's happening around me is not normal. I may not sure what I'm going to do now, but I'm sure that I'm not going to go along with it. That's the most important lesson. It's maybe historically the most important lesson, but it's also psychologically and politically the most important lesson, because if you do obey in advance, if you just decide you're going to adjust, then you become that person who is just adjusted, and it's very hard for you to act later on. And then politically, if you don't act at the beginning, it becomes much harder to act later on.
In Kiev, during the days when we are remembering 4 years since the revolution of dignity, and at the same time there are new challenges. And if I would put it like one of the biggest tragedies with the Russian with the war which is started against Ukraine by Russia after the Maidan revolution was this push of the society to the conflict in the circumstances where the more people are opting for security rather than freedom. Because post-Maidan society immediately was the society which is going in favor of freedoms compared to the security or any other restrictions. When you're looking at Ukraine at this stage, are also, coming after you knew with this post-war like it's not like even a post-war, it's the development which is taking place during the active conflict.
It's very easy to use the excuse of terrorism or the excuse of war to change the regime in an undesirable direction. It's also pretty easy, and this is more like what's happened in Ukraine, to use war as a reason not to reform the state. Whereas in fact, the exact opposite is true. What we know from history is that war is the occasion to reform the state. When you lose a war, that's the time when you have to reform the state. That's your chance to reform the state. So it's very important to see that argument for what it is, and to see that the opposite is true. With security and freedom, it's very important to see, I think, also that although those are two good things, you don't have to always sacrifice one for the other. Sometimes you do. I'm not free to walk onto an airplane without a security check. Sometimes there is a contradiction, but there isn't always. And so it's a little bit of a trap. People say, well, to be more secure, you have to be less free. That's not necessarily true. I think the better way to think about it is that it's the government's job both to protect freedom and to protect security at the same time, and that we should be asking for both of those things, even though sometimes there might be a conflict. That, again, from our point of view as citizens, it's not our job to give up on one to get the other. We should be expecting both.
How also you define the line? There are the issues about the whole concept of this nostalgia for the past, make America great again, and what's happening in Europe, this feeling about, how good the past was. And at the same time, in the country like ours, and you know it better than everybody as a historian who learned and studied Ukrainian history, history of the post-colonial country, where the culture, the Ukrainian culture, had been for a while oppressed. So there are these things. How you define this line between this nostalgia, which is like moving society to the past instead of looking forward, and this revival of the national culture?
With Russia and with the United States, I think a kind of trick is being played where Russian and American leaders talk about going back to the 1940s, but what they really mean is the 1930s. So in Russia, the main object of nostalgia is the Great Fatherland War and winning the Great Fatherland War. And the Great Fatherland War was used as a justification, as every Ukrainian knows, for invading Ukraine, which of course is absurd. But in Russia, what's really happening is the rehabilitation of right-wing thinkers from the 1930s. In the US, there's something similar. When President Trump talks about making America great again, people think of the 40s, 50s, 60s. They think of a time when wealth in the United States was growing and when wealth was being more evenly distributed. But then it turns out that what he's really thinking about, and what his ideologues are really thinking about, is the 1930s, a time when there was Great Depression, when there wasn't a welfare state yet, when wealth was very unevenly distributed. And the fantasy that Trump and his people seem to have is, let's go back to the 1930s, but this time, let's not build a welfare state. This time, let's not go to war. With Ukraine, I think the really important thing is not to fall into the trap of confusing, victimhood with powerlessness. On the one hand, it's extremely important that people in Russia, people in America, people in Europe understand that there was a Holodomor, understand that the famine in Ukraine is essential to the memory of people who live in Ukraine, that has to be respected the way that other people's history and memory are respected. That's extremely important, and and Ukrainians are right to expect that. On the other hand, it's very important that policy in the present not become just about victimhood. Because if it is, then you can get captured in this cycle where all you do is you compete with the Russians or with someone else about the past. And doing that is so much easier, or it feels so much easier than actually building the state.
In the book, you rather define what patriotism is not, that it's not patriotic to not to show your tax returns or to welcome the interference of another state, with a clear reference to Donald Trump. At the same time, there are less explained what patriotism is. And of course, we are here more interested in times of the conflict. Of course, the patriotism also is the word which is a word which can be used in a misleading way. So in the end, what then is patriotism for you?
Yeah, so what I try to do is make a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. And to explain what patriotism is, let me first just say what I think nationalism is. Nationalism is telling people that they are already the best. That's what nationalism is. Nationalism says, no matter what we do, we're the best. And so nationalism in politics it tends to be reactionary. Because it's very hard to do anything with that idea except maybe to fight a war. Patriotism is different. A patriot is someone who says, I love my country, and therefore I want it to be better. And so therefore a patriot can never just say, we're the best all the time, no matter what, because a patriot has some kind of standards. A patriot has thought enough about his country and his place in the world that he's holding it to some standards. Because if you want something to be better, you have to have some standard to judge what's better and what's worse.
You're a historian, but in this particular book, On Tyranny, there are a lot said about the modern television and the social media. So you encourage people to read books rather than to stay in their bubbles, to stay on their computers or watch television. We're living in this age, of course. There are sometimes an excitement about the new technology. But if to be very serious, really, to what extent you are concerned about big tech, about even like the new phenomenons of new media coming to the political life, and what are those concerns?
Yeah. I mean, so if you're a historian, then you know that new forms of media will have unpredictable consequences. Internet is surrounded by a lot of happy talk about how more communication has to be more enlightening or more democratizing. But there's no particular reason to think that that's true. Enlightenment and democracy don't depend on just the random transmission of everything. Enlightenment depends upon people being able to have the chance to learn what's true and reason on that basis. Democracy depends upon people becoming citizens who know the rules of their own political society. So there's really no reason to think that the internet was going to be democratizing, and I don't think it has been. That the internet has a way of specializing itself to what people want to hear, and so whereas if you're going to live in a democracy, you have to be aware that what's true is not the same thing as what you want to hear. Authoritarianism works by convincing people that what they want to hear is the same thing as the truth. And we see this in the United States, unfortunately, where more and more people think that the truth is the stuff that they already believe. And what the internet can do is supply them over and over again with what they already believe. I think the real question is whether what we do on the internet leads us to do something in the real world. I think that's the critical test. Does the internet make us do more stuff on the internet? Or does the internet lead us to do things in the real world? It's like when Mustafa Naim's post in November, speaking of 4 years ago, at the end of it, he said the last sentence of the post is likes don't count, right? In other words, you can't just stay on the internet. You actually have to go back out into the world. So long as the internet directs us back into the real world, I think it's okay.
And Tim, in the end, you're a historian of an Eastern Europe, not just that, of modern history. But this book is more like a manifesto and a call for action. And you're giving lectures. I've seen in the US a lot of books, like your book, this book in particular, like a bestseller. So how do you, really explain that in a way that's not very common to have that, a historian reading something what you need to do instead of just referring to the history. So how do you feel about that? How you explain that? And also this your popularity on the such media in the US, which are very popular among the young audience, like the Daily Show. So how are you living with that? How are you explaining that for yourself? And what is your personal lesson with this experience?
First of all, I'm really glad when I can talk to young people, whether it's on TV or directly, because whether my country is going to be a republic or not, it depends on what young people do, I think, in the next 10 or 20 years. And I think what happened in last year was a surprise to American young people, or a lot of them. They weren't prepared for things to change. And then when things did change, there was a temptation to say, well, it doesn't really matter. And it does matter. It matters. It matters a lot. So for me, that's been really important. And the other side of that is that I try really hard to learn from younger people, whether they're, Americans or Ukrainians. I try to keep what people who are in their 20s think. I try to keep that fresh in my mind. That helps me a lot. The second thing is what lesson there is in this for me. I mean, the thing is, I don't take it as strange to be both a historian and occasionally an activist, because that's what all of my teachers did, or that's what all of my East European teachers did. That's what the people I study do. It's not, if you're in an East European setting, it's not so strange to be, for example, I'm not comparing myself to Hrushevsky, but if you're Hrushevsky, then sometimes you're a historian, and sometimes you're in politics. This is totally normal for East European scholars.